I watched a sitting judge slap my 15-year-old black daughter across the face, right there in a packed courtroom. Lila had only spoken up, respectfully, calmly, and that man leaned over the bench and hit her like she was nothing. The whole room gasped. Nobody moved. Not the bailiff, not the clerk, not the people staring. They just let it happen, like it was normal. When I stood to protect her, the judge sneered and said I was raising an insolent child who hadn't learned her place. The rage I felt, it tasted like blood in my mouth, but I didn't explode. Not yet. Because what Judge Conrad didn't know, what none of them knew, was that I'm not just another father. I'm the U.S. Attorney General, and he just laid his hands on the wrong girl in front of the wrong man. I didn't come for a hearing that day, I came for justice, and by the time I was done, Judge Conrad would wish he'd never been born. But let's start at the beginning. Before we dive in, let me know where in the world you're listening from today. I've stood in courtrooms all my life. From a public defender's folding table to the marbled halls of federal justice, I've breathed the stale air of legal proceedings until it became as familiar as my own home. But something felt different that morning as Lila and I climbed the worn limestone steps of the Calhoun County Courthouse. My daughter walked beside me, her school backpack slung over one shoulder, her curly hair pulled back in a neat ponytail. At 15, she was all long limbs and quiet dignity, handling this ridiculous situation with more grace than most adults could muster. "You ready?" I asked, pausing at the heavy wooden doors. Lila nodded, straightening her blouse. "It's just a hearing, Dad. We'll explain what happened, and it'll be fine." I wished I shared her confidence. Something about the stairs following us from the parking lot had triggered the warning system I'd developed over decades in law. The suspension was trivial, a misunderstanding over a classroom debate that had escalated when a teacher took offense to Lila questioning historical facts in their outdated textbook. Nothing that should require the county judge's attention. Yet here we were. Inside, the courthouse smelled of lemon polish and ancient paper. The main corridor's high ceilings amplified every footstep as locals fell silent, tracking our progress. I felt the weight of their stares, some curious, others hostile, pressing against my skin. "Third door on the right," the clerk muttered when I asked for directions, barely looking up from her computer. The courtroom itself was smaller than I expected, with dark wood paneling and threadbare carpet that had seen better decades. About 20 people sat scattered among the benches, all turning to watch us enter. None of them smiled. "Sit here," I told Lila, guiding her to the front row. I squeezed her shoulder gently. "Remember what we discussed. Just answer truthfully and respectfully." "I know, Dad," she whispered back. "I've watched you work since I was little." That brought a brief smile to my face. My daughter, who'd fallen asleep to legal briefs as bedtime stories and grown up watching me battle injustice from the highest office in American law enforcement. She knew the system better than most attorneys. What neither of us knew was Judge Conrad. "All rise." The bailiff's voice cracked through the room like a whip. He entered from a side door, a heavy-set man in his late 60s with thinning white hair and skin like uncooked dough. His black robe hung loosely from broad shoulders, and his mouth was set in a permanent frown beneath cold blue eyes. The Confederate pin on his lapel caught the fluorescent light, a deliberate statement I couldn't miss. My stomach tightened. 25 years in law had taught me to read people quickly, and everything about Judge Conrad screamed danger. "Be seated," he growled, lowering himself into his chair with a grunt. He shuffled papers, deliberately slow, before looking up. His gaze passed over me dismissively before landing on Lila. Something changed in his expression, a tightening around the eyes, a subtle shift that sent alarm bells ringing through my head. "Case number 47B, disciplinary hearing for Lila Washington," the clerk announced. Judge Conrad leaned forward. "So you're the troublemaker questioning our teacher's authority." Before I could intervene, Lila spoke up. "Your Honor, I respectfully disagree with that characterization. I simply asked about historical—" The change was instant. Conrad's face flushed crimson, veins bulging at his temples. "You will speak when spoken to, young lady," he bellowed. Lila blinked, startled but composed. "I apologize, Your Honor, but I was answering your direct question." What happened next seemed to unfold in slow motion. Conrad rose from his seat, leaning over the bench. His arm swung out, a blur of black robe and pale flesh, connecting with Lila's cheek with a crack that echoed through the stunned courtroom. My daughter's head snapped sideways. A red handprint bloomed instantly on her brown skin. Gasps rippled through the room. Lila's eyes widened in shock, her hand rising slowly to her face. Every muscle in my body coiled to spring. 20 years of martial arts training, of disciplined response to threat, demanded I vault over the barrier and tear Conrad apart with my bare hands. The prosecutor in me cataloged the assault. The father in me screamed for blood. I gripped the wooden bench before me until my knuckles whitened, forcing air slowly through my nose. 1, 2, 3. I counted silently, battling the rage threatening to explode through my chest. Moving now would destroy everything, my career, my daughter's future, everything I'd built. Conrad would walk free while I rotted in a cell. The strategic part of my brain, the part that had guided me through decades of legal warfare, knew there was a better way. Your Honor, I managed, my voice unnaturally calm, I believe you've just committed assault on a minor in front of 24 witnesses. Conrad's eyes narrowed, his jowls quivering with contempt. I believe I've disciplined an insolent child who hasn't learned her place, something her father clearly failed to teach her. My gaze shifted to the bailiff, catching the smirk playing at the corners of his mouth. Then to the clerk, who suddenly found her paperwork fascinating. To the spectators, who looked anywhere but at us. No one moved to help, no one objected. This wasn't an anomaly. It was business as usual. In that moment, I understood. This wasn't just about a school suspension. This was Conrad's kingdom, where he ruled through fear and tradition, where people like us were expected to bow and scrape or suffer the consequences. I placed my hand gently on Lila's shoulder, feeling her trembling beneath my palm. We're not finished, Conrad growled, settling back into his chair. No, I thought, meeting his gaze steadily. We're just getting started. The silence that followed felt like a physical weight. No one coughed, no one shuffled papers. The air conditioning hummed, suddenly the loudest sound in the room. Lila's cheek blazed red, her eyes wide with shock rather than tears. I kept my hand on her shoulder, steadying us both. Judge Conrad stared down at us, his expression a mixture of contempt and something darker, satisfaction. He'd enjoyed it. The realization made my blood run cold. This court finds the student's behavior unacceptable, Conrad finally spoke, his voice echoing in the silent room. The school's 2-week suspension is upheld, with an additional week added for contempt displayed in my courtroom. He lifted his gavel, pausing deliberately before bringing it down with a crack that made Lila flinch beside me. Court is adjourned. The sound broke the spell. Suddenly everyone was moving at once, papers shuffling, chairs scraping, voices rising in a nervous murmur. I caught fragments of whispered conversations. Never seen him actually hit someone before, and that family should have known better than to. I leaned close to Lila's ear. We're leaving now. Head high, baby girl. Don't give them the satisfaction. Her nod was almost imperceptible, but I felt her spine straighten beneath my palm. Pride and fury tangled in my chest as I guided her toward the exit, keeping my body slightly between her and Conrad's bench. Mr. Washington, Conrad called after us, his voice dripping with false courtesy. I trust we won't be seeing you in my courtroom again. I didn't turn around, didn't trust myself to speak. Just kept walking, one hand on Lila's back, feeling the tremors she was fighting to control. The heavy wooden doors of the courtroom seemed miles away. Each step echoed on the polished floor, announcing our retreat. The weight of every stair pressed against my back, but I refused to hurry, refused to run. It's okay, Dad, Lila whispered, her voice steady despite everything. I'm okay. My brilliant, brave girl, trying to comfort me when it should have been the other way around. I know you are, I murmured back, and I'm so proud of you, but this isn't over. We pushed through the doors into the courthouse hallway, where a small crowd had gathered. Cell phones were raised, recording our exit. News traveled fast in small towns. The assault of a black teenager by a white judge was apparently worth documenting, though I doubted it was out of concern for Lila. I heard the click of photos being taken, saw the flash of screens as we passed. My prosecutor's mind cataloged faces, calculating potential witnesses, potential threats. "Keep walking," I said softly, steering Lila toward the building's main entrance. "Don't engage with anyone." The courthouse steps descended to a small parking area where our rental car waited. The bright afternoon sun hit my eyes like a physical blow after the dim courtroom. I blinked, scanning our surroundings with the heightened awareness that comes with adrenaline. That's when I saw them, 3 men leaning against a pickup truck watching us with undisguised hostility. They wore work clothes, but their posture wasn't casual. One spat on the ground as we passed. Another crossed his arms, biceps flexing beneath a faded t-shirt. The third just stared, a toothpick rolling from one side of his mouth to the other. I tightened my grip on Lila's shoulder, guiding her more quickly now. "Dad?" she questioned, sensing my tension. "Almost there," I assured her, keeping my voice even while my eyes continued scanning. A sheriff's cruiser idled at the corner of the parking lot. Relief flickered briefly until I made eye contact with the officer inside. He was watching us, that much was clear, but when our eyes met, he deliberately looked away. His message couldn't have been clearer. We were on our own. My heart hammered against my ribs. This wasn't just about a courtroom humiliation. Something deeper was happening, something that had the entire town closing ranks. I unlocked the car with trembling fingers, opening Lila's door first. "Get in, lock your door," I instructed, my voice dropping to a near whisper. As she slid into the passenger seat, I felt rather than saw movement behind us. The men had pushed off from their truck, not approaching yet, but repositioning themselves. Watching, waiting. A chill ran down my spine despite the warm day. In Washington, D.C., I had power, resources, a team of people who respected my authority as Attorney General. Here, 2 hours from the nearest major city, in a town where Judge Conrad's word was apparently law, we were isolated, vulnerable. I circled to the driver's side, keeping my movements deliberate, refusing to show fear. As I opened my door, I heard the crunch of gravel, someone approaching. I slid into the seat quickly, locked the doors, and started the engine in one fluid motion. In the rear-view mirror, I saw the sheriff finally stirring, pulling his cruiser forward. Not to help us, I suspected, but to ensure we left. "Dad?" Lila's voice was small now, her earlier bravery cracking slightly. "What's happening?" I reached for her hand, squeezing it gently as I navigated out of the parking lot. "I don't know yet, baby, but we're going to be okay." The words felt hollow even as I said them, because the truth was sinking in with terrifying clarity. We weren't just dealing with a corrupt judge. We were trapped in his territory, surrounded by his people, and someone had just painted a target on our backs. I drove us back to the hotel in tense silence, constantly checking the rearview mirror to see if we were being followed. Lila stared out the window, one hand absently touching her cheek where Conrad's hand had left a faint red mark. My blood boiled every time I glanced at it. "You should eat something," I said as we entered our adjoining rooms at the Holiday Inn Express on the edge of town. It was the only decent accommodation within 20 miles. "I'm not hungry," she replied, sinking onto the edge of the bed. I nodded, understanding completely. My own stomach was in knots. "Try anyway. I'll order something light." While waiting for room service, I turned on the local news, hoping to gauge how much attention our courthouse incident had received. The answer came quickly and hit like a punch to the gut. "Breaking news tonight," the anchor announced with practiced concern. Chaos erupted in Judge William Conrad's courtroom today when a teenager allegedly became violent during a routine disciplinary hearing. "What?" Lila gasped from beside me. The screen showed grainy cell phone footage from inside the courtroom, but something was wrong. The video started immediately after Conrad had struck Lila, showing only my daughter's shocked reaction and my own half-rise from my seat. The angle made it appear as though Lila had lunged toward the bench. "Sources close to the courthouse say the minor, whose name is being withheld, had to be restrained after threatening the judge," the reporter continued. "Judge Conrad, who has served this county for over 30 years, was reportedly unharmed in the altercation. My fists clenched so tightly my knuckles turned white. "They're lying," I whispered. "They edited the footage." The broadcast continued with an interview of a courthouse regular who claimed to have witnessed the whole thing. "That girl was out of control," the elderly white woman stated firmly. "Judge Conrad was just defending himself. You know how these out-of-towners can be when they don't get their way." Lila's face had gone pale. "Dad, they're making it sound like I know, baby." I grabbed the remote and muted the television. "Don't worry, we have the truth on our side." But even as I said it, I felt a cold knot of dread forming in my stomach. This wasn't just a misunderstanding. This was coordinated. The edited footage, the immediate witness interviews. Conrad was mobilizing the entire town against us. "What are we going to do?" Lila's voice trembled, the brave front she'd maintained all day finally cracking. I sat beside her, wrapping my arm around her shoulders. "First thing tomorrow, we're calling Ellen Ramirez at the Washington Post. She owes me a favor, and this kind of small-town corruption is exactly what she specializes in." Lila leaned against me, her body shaking slightly. "Why is this happening?" All I did was ask a question. I wished I had a simple answer. The truth was more complicated and more insidious. A black man and his daughter challenging authority in a town where Conrad had ruled unchallenged for decades. But I couldn't burden her with that reality, not yet. "Some people abuse power because they can," I said finally. "But not for long, not when we're done." A harsh knock at the door made us both jump. 3 sharp raps, authoritative and demanding. "Stay here," I told Lila, moving to the peephole. Through the distorted lens, I saw a tan uniform. Sheriff's Department. My instinct screamed danger, but refusing to answer would only escalate things. I opened the door partway, keeping my foot wedged against it. "Can I help you, officer?" The deputy was young, maybe 30, with close-cropped hair and a smug expression that set my teeth on edge. "Mr. Pearson, I'm Deputy Larson with the County Sheriff's Office." "What can I do for you, Deputy?" He held out an official-looking envelope. "I'm here to serve you with these papers." I took the envelope, already knowing what I'd find inside. Still, seeing the words, "felony assault charges," printed above Lila's name sent ice through my veins. "This is ridiculous," I said, keeping my voice measured despite the rage building inside me. My daughter was the victim here. Judge Conrad struck her in open court. Deputy Larson's smile didn't reach his eyes. "That's not how the witnesses remember it, sir. Judge Conrad has signed the complaint himself. Your daughter is to appear for arraignment in 6 days, 9 a.m. sharp. And if we've returned to D.C. by then?" The deputy's expression hardened. "Then a warrant will be issued, and we'll have federal marshals pick her up at your fancy Georgetown home." He leaned in slightly. "Of course, it'd be a shame for the Attorney General's daughter to be dragged out of school in handcuffs. Makes for ugly headlines." The threat was unmistakable. I wanted nothing more than to slam the door in his face, but years as a prosecutor had taught me when to hold my fire. "Is there anything else, Deputy?" "Just friendly advice, sir." His tone made the words sound like an insult. "Show up for the arraignment. Things go smoother when folks cooperate." After he left, I locked the door and checked all the windows, pulling the curtains tight. Something made me peer through a small gap in the fabric, scanning the parking lot. There it was, an unmarked sedan with tinted windows idling directly across from our rooms. The dome light briefly illuminated as someone inside lit a cigarette, revealing the silhouette of a man watching our door. They weren't just threatening us, they were monitoring us. I turned back to Lila, who stood frozen in the middle of the room, the served papers clutched in her trembling hands. "Dad?" Her voice was barely audible. "Am I really going to jail?" "No," I said firmly, taking the papers from her and placing them on the desk. "Not now, not ever. But we need to be very careful about our next move." I spent the next morning working the phones. First call was to Ellen Ramirez at the Washington Post, but it went straight to voicemail. I left a detailed message, emphasizing the urgency. No callback. "Let's try the local paper," I told Lila over our untouched breakfast. "Small towns hate bad publicity." The Oak Ridge Gazette receptionist put me through to the editor, a man named Harris. I introduced myself and started explaining what happened in the courtroom. "I know who you are, Mr. Pearson," Harris interrupted, his voice suddenly cold. "And I know about the incident. Judge Conrad is a pillar of this community, been on the bench 30 years. He struck my 15-year-old daughter in open court," I said, gripping the phone tighter. "That's not how I heard it. Look, I've got a deadline. Good day." The line went dead. I stared at the phone, stunned. "They hung up on you?" Lila asked, pushing her scrambled eggs around the plate. "But you're the Attorney General." "Not here," I said quietly. "Here. I'm just an outsider causing trouble." I tried 3 more local news outlets with the same result. Each conversation ended the moment I mentioned Conrad's name. By noon, I'd moved on to the state's attorney's office. "I need to speak with Rebecca Holloway," I told the receptionist, naming the state's attorney I'd worked with on a federal case last year. "I'm sorry, she's in meetings all day." "This is urgent. Tell her it's Marcus Pearson calling." "I understand, sir. I'll have her call you back." She never did. Neither did her deputy nor anyone else I tried to reach. My calls to the State Bar Association, the Judicial Conduct Board, and even the governor's office all vanished into the same black hole. Around 4 o'clock, my phone rang. Unknown number. "Hello? Mr. Pearson?" The voice was female, elderly, and whispering. "This is Martha Jean. I work at the courthouse. Been there 30 years. "Yes?" I sat up straighter. "Don't trust anyone in this county, not the papers, not the sheriff, and especially not the state attorney's office." "What do you know about all this?" "Conrad's got half the state in his pocket. His brother-in-law is the governor's chief of staff. His cousin runs the largest construction company in 3 counties. They've been squeezing out anyone who doesn't play ball for decades." My stomach tightened. "Why are you telling me this?" A long pause. "I saw what he did to your girl. It wasn't the first time he's hit someone in that courtroom, but nobody ever stood up to him after." Her voice cracked slightly. "I should have spoken up years ago. Will you testify? Make a statement?" "I can't, but I'll help however I can. There's files, evidence of what he's been doing. I can get them to you." "When?" "Tomorrow. I'll find you." The line went dead. I looked over at Lila, who was curled up on the hotel bed with a book she wasn't really reading. "I need to drive to the next county," I told her. "See if I can find someone there who isn't under Conrad's thumb." "Can I come?" The fear in her eyes broke my heart. "Better if you stay here. Lock the door, don't answer for anyone but me." I handed her my backup phone. "Call me if anything happens." The drive to West Ridge County took 40 minutes. I spent 3 hours there, moving from the sheriff's office to the courthouse to the local paper. Each time I'd start making progress, then watch as whoever I was speaking with would get a call or a text. Their demeanor would change instantly. One deputy actually said, "Sorry, sir. Just got word you're trouble." By the time I headed back, darkness had fallen. I called Lila twice to check in. She was fine, watching TV with the door locked and chained. I pulled into the hotel parking lot just after 8, bone-tired and seething with frustration. The walk to our adjoining rooms on the 2nd floor felt longer than usual. I unlocked my door, flipped on the light, and froze. The room was destroyed. My laptop lay smashed on the floor, its screen shattered and case cracked open. The desk drawers had been emptied, their contents scattered. My briefcase had been sliced open, important papers shredded into confetti across the carpet. Even the mattress had been flipped, its underside slashed with a knife. This wasn't a robbery. This was a message. My heart hammering, I rushed to the connecting door to Lila's room. It was still locked from both sides. I pounded on it. "Lila, open up." No answer. "Lila." I heard movement, then her sleepy voice. "Dad?" The door opened, revealing my daughter in pajamas, hair mussed from sleep. Relief flooded through me as I pulled her into a tight hug. "What's wrong?" she mumbled against my shoulder. I glanced back at my destroyed room. "Nothing. Just checking on you." I guided her back to her untouched room, thankful they hadn't violated her space. "Go back to sleep. I'll be right here." After she dozed off again, I sat in the dark by her window, mind racing. We were being watched, threatened, isolated. Every system that should protect us had been corrupted or intimidated. We had 5 days until the arraignment, and no allies except a courthouse employee I'd never met. As I sat there piecing together our options, headlights swept across the window. A vehicle pulled into the lot, moving slowly past the rows of parked cars. It stopped directly beneath our window, engine idling. I peered through the curtain gap. A black SUV with tinted windows. No markings. No license plate. I didn't sleep that night. After the SUV finally drove away, I spent hours sitting in that chair by the window, watching the parking lot like a hawk. Every shadow made me tense. Every distant engine sound had me reaching for my phone. By dawn, I knew we needed to change tactics fast. "We're going out for breakfast," I told Lila as she emerged from the bathroom, hair still damp from her shower. "Pack your essentials in your backpack. We might not come back here." Her eyes widened, but she nodded without question. My girl had always been quick on the uptake. "Are we running?" she asked quietly, stuffing clothes into her bag. "No," I said firmly. "We're regrouping. There's a difference. We left most of our things in the room but took everything important. I paid cash at the front desk for another night anyway. Let them think we'd be back." 20 minutes later, we slid into a booth at Maggie's Diner, a faded establishment on the edge of town. The vinyl seats were cracked, the menus laminated and worn at the edges, the kind of place that hadn't changed in 30 years. "Order whatever you want," I told Lila. "You need your strength." She nodded, but I could see the strain in her eyes. The bruise on her cheek had faded to a sickly yellow, but the memory of Conrad's hand striking her was still fresh. I reached across the table and squeezed her hand. "We're going to be okay," I promised. "I've got a plan." I didn't, not really, but I had to. Our waitress, a tired-looking woman in her 50s, brought coffee for me and hot chocolate for Lila. As she set down our drinks, I noticed an older woman watching us from across the diner. She sat alone at a small table, her silver hair partially hidden under a patterned scarf. When our eyes met, she didn't look away immediately. Instead, she held my gaze with an intensity that made me uneasy. "Dad?" Lila whispered, leaning forward. "That lady keeps staring at us." "I know. Just eat your breakfast. We'll leave soon." Throughout the meal, I felt the woman's eyes on us. She wasn't trying to hide her interest, but something about her seemed different from the hostile locals we'd encountered so far. There was conflict in her expression, something almost like guilt. When we finished eating, I paid the bill and ushered Lila toward the door. As we passed the older woman's table, she suddenly reached out and touched my arm. I tensed, ready to pull away, but her touch wasn't threatening. "Your daughter has her grandmother's eyes," she said softly, her gaze flicking to Lila. I frowned. "You didn't know my mother?" A sad smile crossed her face. "No, I didn't." She withdrew her hand and returned to her coffee. We were almost to the door when a young waitress brushed past me, bumping my shoulder. "Sorry," she mumbled, not meeting my eyes. It wasn't until we reached the car that I felt the small piece of paper in my jacket pocket. I unfolded it carefully, shielding it from view. "Meet me at the old library after dark. I can help. Martha Jean." I stared at the note, then glanced back at the diner. Through the window, I could see the silver-haired woman still sitting at her table, now looking down at her coffee. "What's that?" Lila asked. I tucked the note away. "Maybe nothing. Maybe everything." We spent the day driving to neighboring counties, stopping at law offices that couldn't help us and newspapers that wouldn't. By sunset, we'd checked into a different motel 20 miles from town, paid cash, and used fake names. "Stay here," I told Lila, setting up the TV and ordering pizza. "Lock the door. Don't open it for anyone but me." "Where are you going?" Fear edged into her voice. "To meet someone who might be able to help us." I kissed her forehead. "I'll be back before midnight. If I'm not, there's cash in the blue bag. Call your aunt in Chicago." The rain started as I drove back toward town. By the time I reached the abandoned library, a Victorian building with boarded windows and a condemned sign, it was coming down in sheets. I parked 2 blocks away and approached on foot, rain pelting my jacket and soaking through to my skin. The side door was ajar, just as the note had implied it would be. I slipped inside, my shoes squeaking on the dusty marble floor. The building smelled of mold and old paper, the air heavy with decades of neglect. "Hello?" I called softly, my voice echoing through the empty space. "Back here." I followed the voice to what had once been the reference section. Martha Jean stood beside a large oak table, her scarf now removed to fully reveal her silver hair. Up close, she looked older than I'd first thought, well into her 70s with deep lines etched around her eyes and mouth. "You came," she said, sounding almost surprised. "I didn't have much choice." I kept my distance, still wary. "How do I know this isn't a trap?" "You don't." Her frankness caught me off guard. "But if I wanted to hurt you, I wouldn't need to lure you to an abandoned building. Conrad owns the police, the courts, even the hospital. He could have you disappeared in broad daylight." The blunt assessment chilled me more than the rain had. "You said you could help," I prompted. Martha Jean nodded, pulling a thick manila envelope from her bag. "Conrad's dirt goes deeper than you know. I've worked in that courthouse for 43 years, seen things that would curdle your blood." "Like what?" "Bribes, falsified evidence, at least a dozen innocent people sent to prison because they crossed him or someone in his circle." She pushed the envelope toward me. "And worse. Much worse." I reached for the envelope, my heart racing with a mixture of dread and hope. This could be exactly what we needed. Concrete evidence of Conrad's corruption. Before my fingers touched the paper, Martha Jean's head snapped up. Her eyes widened in alarm. "Someone's here," she whispered. I heard it then. Footsteps echoing down the hallway, heavy and deliberate, not trying to hide their approach. "Go!" Martha Jean hissed, shoving a bundle of yellowed papers into my hands. "Back exit, now." I hesitated for a split second. "What about you?" "I've lived here all my life, they won't suspect me." Her eyes flashed with decades of pent-up defiance. "Now move." The footsteps grew louder, accompanied by the beam of flashlights dancing against the far wall. I stuffed the papers inside my jacket and crouched low, making my way toward the side door. My heart hammered against my ribs as I eased it open, praying the hinges wouldn't creak. A voice echoed through the library. "Who's in here? This is private property." I slipped through the door into the pouring rain, pulling it shut behind me with agonizing slowness. The darkness outside swallowed me as I pressed my back against the brick wall, listening. Through the door, I could make out Martha Jean's voice pitched high with fake surprise. "Lord have mercy, you scared me half to death just looking for my old reading glasses. I think I left them when they closed this place down." I didn't wait to hear more. Keeping low, I sprinted through the rain, away from the streetlights, my shoes splashing through puddles. I cut through an overgrown lot, doubled back through an alley, and circled around to where I'd parked. My clothes were soaked through, but adrenaline kept me from feeling the cold. I drove exactly at the speed limit all the way back to the cabin we'd rented, checking my rearview mirror obsessively. No headlights followed me down the winding country roads. The papers inside my jacket felt like they were burning a hole through to my skin. Lila opened the door before I could even knock. "Dad, you're drenched." "I'm fine." I locked the door behind me, drew the curtains, and peeled off my wet jacket. "Get me some towels, will you?" While she fetched them, I carefully extracted the bundle of papers, now damp at the edges but mostly intact. I laid them on the kitchen table, my hands trembling slightly. This could be nothing, or it could be everything. "What is all that?" Lila asked, returning with towels. She draped one around my shoulders. "Evidence, I hope." I started spreading the papers out. Martha Jean came through. "The lady from the diner?" Lila pulled up a chair beside me. "You think we can trust her?" Someone was definitely following me, and she covered for me. I ran a hand through my wet hair. For now, she's all we've got. The papers were a mismatched collection, photocopies of court documents, handwritten notes on legal pad paper, even photographs. As we sorted through them, a pattern emerged. Cases where evidence had mysteriously disappeared. Trials where key witnesses suddenly changed their testimony. Bank statements showing large deposits to an offshore account immediately after controversial verdicts. And at the center of it all, Judge Conrad. "Look at this," Lila said, holding up a photograph. It showed Conrad standing next to a much younger man at what looked like a hunting lodge. They were shaking hands, both smiling. "Isn't that the governor?" I took the photo, studying it closely. Yes, dated 15 years ago. I flipped it over. On the back, in faded ink, "C gets appellate appointment. Deal sealed." What does that mean? It means Conrad didn't rise to power by merit. I set the photo down and picked up a handwritten note that appeared to be from Martha Jean herself. He bought and bullied his way up, with powerful friends covering his tracks. We spent the next 2 hours poring over everything. Martha Jean had been thorough, meticulous even. Her own notes outlined exactly how Conrad's corruption worked, which clerks were on his payroll, which officers tampered with evidence, how court fees mysteriously disappeared only to fund his private ventures. Most damning of all was a list of 8 names, people who had stood up to Conrad over the years. Next to each name was a fate: prison, bankrupt, committed, and in 2 cases, simply accident. "Jesus," I whispered. Martha Jean had paper-clipped a note to the front of the bundle. I read it aloud. "This must be timed perfectly. Conrad has friends at every level. Go too early and they'll discredit you. Wait too long and they'll destroy you. You have 1 shot." She'd outlined the steps, gather additional corroboration from 2 former clerks she named, both had moved away years ago, prepare the evidence for maximum impact, and time the release to coincide with the State Judicial Review Committee's quarterly meeting, 4 days from now. "Dad?" Lila's voice pulled me from my thoughts. She was holding one of the photographs, her fingers trembling slightly. "This is the bailiff, the one who was smirking when the judge hit me." I looked at the photo. The same man, 20 years younger, standing over what appeared to be a badly beaten suspect. Conrad was visible in the background, arms crossed, watching. "We've got them," I said, trying to sound confident. "We just need to follow Martha Jean's plan." I started drafting our next steps on a notepad, mapping out how we'd reach the former clerks, which journalists to contact, how to protect ourselves in the meantime. Lila watched me silently, her eyes following my pen across the paper. "Dad," she said finally, her voice small, "what if they come for me first?" My pen froze mid-word. I looked up at my daughter, my brave, beautiful girl whose only crime had been standing up for herself. Her voice cracked as she continued. "The arraignment is in 3 days. That's before the Judicial Committee meets. What if they lock me up before we can expose them?" My blood ran cold as the reality of our situation crystallized. We weren't just fighting for justice anymore. We were racing against time to save my daughter from becoming another name on Conrad's list of victims. Morning arrived with an eerie calm. The cabin windows glowed pale amber as sunlight filtered through the surrounding pines. I hadn't slept, not really. Just dozed in fits between checking our exits and reviewing Martha Jean's documents. "Lila?" I called softly, padding down the hallway to her room. She was curled on her side, one hand tucked under her cheek. For a moment, she looked like she was 8 again, when her biggest worry was mastering multiplication tables. My chest tightened. How had we ended up here? Hunted, cornered, with her future hanging by a thread. I gently closed her door and returned to the kitchen table, spread with our evidence and my hastily scribbled plans. The strategy was taking shape. We'd package everything into an encrypted file drop, timed to hit 3 national news outlets simultaneously. I'd included a personal statement detailing what happened in the courtroom, along with Martha Jean's evidence of Conrad's corruption. The timing was crucial. 2 days before Lila's arraignment, enough time for the story to break wide open, but not so early that Conrad's allies could spin a counter-narrative. Every 20 minutes or so, I'd get up and check on Lila again. Just a quick glance through her doorway, watching the rise and fall of her breathing. Each time, relief would wash over me, followed immediately by a fresh wave of anxiety. Around 9, she emerged from her room, hair tousled, eyes still heavy with sleep. "Morning," she mumbled, heading straight for the coffee I'd brewed. "Sleep okay?" I asked, clearing space at the table. She shrugged, wrapping both hands around her mug. "Not really." We ate breakfast in relative silence. I could see her mind working, processing everything that had happened, everything that was still to come. "I think I've got the upload ready," I told her, turning my laptop so she could see. "Scheduled for tomorrow night. Once it hits, there's no going back." She nodded, studying the screen. "What happens after? Assuming it works?" "Conrad and his cronies will have bigger problems than pursuing charges against you. The State Judicial Committee will have to investigate, and the FBI might get involved too." "And if it doesn't work?" I reached across the table and squeezed her hand. "It will. But if something goes wrong, I've got contingency plans." She didn't look convinced, but she squeezed back. The rest of the morning, I fine-tuned our digital package. Each piece of evidence was meticulously labeled, cross-referenced, and arranged for maximum impact. I'd included contact information from Martha Jean's 2 former clerk sources, though I hadn't been able to reach them yet. Lila paced the cabin, occasionally peering out windows, jumping at small noises. Around noon, her phone buzzed. She glanced at the screen. "It's Ava," she said, referring to her best friend back home. "I should probably talk to her. She's been texting nonstop." I nodded. "Just be careful what you say." "I know, Dad." She rolled her eyes, the familiar teenage gesture almost comforting in its normalcy. She stepped onto the small porch, closing the door behind her. I heard the murmur of her voice as she walked around the side of the cabin. I returned to my work, double-checking the encryption on our file drop. 5 minutes passed, then 10. The murmur of Lila's voice had stopped. A prickle of unease crawled up my spine. "Lila?" I called out, rising from my chair. No answer. I moved to the window, scanning the yard. No sign of her. "Lila!" I called louder, striding to the front door and yanking it open. The porch was empty. So was the side yard. My heart rate kicked up as I circled the cabin. "Lila." Nothing but the whisper of pine needles in the breeze. I sprinted down the dirt driveway, calling her name, panic clawing its way up my throat. Halfway down, something caught my eye. A small object in the dirt. Her phone. I snatched it up. The call with Ava was still connected, but silent. "Ava?" I said frantically. "Ava, are you there? Mr. Harris?" Her voice was confused. "Where's Lila?" We were just talking, and then she started saying something weird. "What did she say?" My voice was barely controlled. Something like, "What are you?" And then nothing. I thought we got disconnected. Blood roared in my ears. I spun around, scanning the surrounding forest, the fog that had settled in the low areas between trees. "Lila!" I bellowed, my voice echoing through the pines. That's when I heard it, the growl of an engine starting up somewhere down the road just out of sight beyond the curve. My body moved before my brain could process. I sprinted toward the sound, gravel crunching under my feet, lungs burning. As I rounded the bend, I caught a glimpse of taillights disappearing into the morning fog. "No!" I screamed, pushing harder, knowing it was futile. The car was already gone, swallowed by the mist, taking my daughter with it. I staggered to a stop, gasping for breath, Lila's phone still clutched in my hand. The terrible silence of the forest closed in around me, broken only by my ragged breathing and the distant, fading rumble of the engine that carried away my child. My worst fear had just become reality. I ran until my lungs burned, until my legs threatened to buckle beneath me. But it was useless. The car, and Lila, were gone, swallowed by the misty forest roads that snaked through the mountains like arteries. Standing there in the middle of the empty road, my breath coming in desperate gasps, I felt something inside me crack. My daughter was gone, taken, and I knew exactly who was behind it. My hands trembled as I pulled out my phone. Martha Jean answered on the second ring. "They took her," I said, my voice hollow. "They took Lila." There was a sharp intake of breath on the other end. "Where are you?" "On the road near the cabin, someone grabbed her while she was outside on the phone. I heard a car leaving, but by the time I got here..." My voice broke. "Listen to me carefully," Martha Jean said, her voice steady but urgent. "Conrad's people won't just scare you. They finish problems. And right now, you and your daughter are their biggest problem." Ice formed in my veins. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying we don't have much time. They won't keep her somewhere obvious. They'll have a place, somewhere remote, somewhere they can control." "I need to call the police," I said, already knowing how futile that would be. "And tell them what? That the most powerful man in the county kidnapped your daughter? The same man who controls the sheriff's department?" Her voice softened. "We're on our own here." The reality of our situation crashed down on me. I'd wasted precious days trying to work within a system that was rotten to its core. I'd been cautious, methodical, when I should have been getting Lila out of this godforsaken place the moment Conrad put his hands on her. "This is my fault," I whispered, self-loathing washing over me. "I should have..." "Stop it," Martha Jean cut in sharply. "Guilt won't help her now. Come back to the cabin. Look for anything they might have left behind. Any clue. I'll make some calls, see if I can find out where they might have taken her." I nodded, then realized she couldn't see me. "Okay, I'll call you if I find anything." The walk back to the cabin felt endless. Each step was an accusation. You failed her. You weren't fast enough. You weren't smart enough. You weren't enough. By the time I reached the cabin, the afternoon light was beginning to fade, casting long shadows through the trees. Inside, I moved with desperate purpose, searching every corner, every surface for anything that might lead me to Lila. The main room revealed nothing. Neither did the tiny kitchen. I moved to Lila's bedroom, where her few belongings were scattered. A sweatshirt tossed over a chair, her notebook on the nightstand, her backpack leaning against the wall. I went through everything methodically, fighting against the panic that threatened to overwhelm me. Nothing in her backpack. Nothing in her notebook but school notes and doodles. Nothing under the pillows or blankets. As daylight continued to bleed away, I dropped to my knees and looked under the bed. A thin layer of dust covered the wooden floorboards, except for a rectangular clean spot where something had recently been moved. I reached my arm into the darkness, feeling blindly until my fingers brushed against a scrap of paper wedged between the bed frame and the floor. I pulled it out and squinted at it in the fading light. It was a hand-drawn map, the paper worn and creased. Crude lines depicted what looked like forest roads, with a red X marked near what appeared to be a lake or pond. Next to the X, someone had scrawled Dobbins Lodge in cramped handwriting. My heart pounded. This wasn't Lila's handwriting. Someone else had drawn this, someone who knew the area. Had Martha Jean slipped it to her? Or had Lila found it somewhere else? It didn't matter. What mattered was that this might lead me to my daughter. I studied the map intently, committing every line, every landmark to memory. Then I folded it carefully and slipped it into my pocket. I grabbed my jacket, checked that my phone was charged, and headed for the door. As I stepped outside, the last rays of sunlight were disappearing behind the mountains. The forest was growing dark, the shadows deepening between the trees. A rational part of my brain knew I should wait until morning. That wandering unfamiliar mountain roads at night was dangerous. But rationality had no place in my mind anymore. Not when Lila was out there, scared and alone. Not when every minute that passed might be bringing her closer to harm. I got into my car and started the engine, resolve hardening in my chest like concrete. The man who had hurt my daughter once had taken her again. But this time I wouldn't hesitate. This time I wouldn't play by the rules. This time I would do whatever it took to get her back. As I pulled onto the road, Martha Jean's warning echoed in my mind. Conrad's people won't just scare you. They finish problems. What she didn't understand was that I wasn't the problem anymore. I was the solution. Night wrapped around me like a shroud as I pushed the rental car hard along the mountain roads. The headlights cut weak yellow paths through the darkness, barely illuminating the crumbling asphalt that twisted and turned without warning. My knuckles were white on the steering wheel. My jaw clenched so tight my teeth ached. I glanced at my phone again. No service mocked me from the screen, and the GPS app had frozen 15 minutes ago on a blank stretch of digital nowhere. The map I'd found under Lila's bed was etched in my mind, but translating those crude lines to these winding roads in pitch darkness was like trying to read Braille with gloves on. "Hold on, baby," I whispered into the empty car. "I'm coming." The rental car, a tired Nissan with balding tires and suspicious noises coming from somewhere under the hood, protested as I pushed it around another hairpin turn. A pothole sent me lurching against the seatbelt, my head nearly hitting the roof. Come on," I muttered, squinting through the windshield. The forest pressed in close on both sides, trees reaching over the road like grasping fingers. Every shadow looked like a person. Every rustle in the underbrush sent my heart rate spiking. I'd been driving for nearly 2 hours, the roads getting narrower and rougher with each passing mile. Doubt gnawed at me. What if I was reading the map wrong? What if Dobbins Lodge was just some random name that meant nothing? What if Lila wasn't there at all? I couldn't think like that. I had to believe this was the right path, the only path. The car jolted over another rut and I winced as something scraped along the undercarriage. The engine made a whining sound that couldn't possibly be good. If this car broke down out here, in the middle of nowhere with no cell service, I pushed the thought away and focused on the road ahead. 20 minutes later, the trees suddenly parted and the road forked. No signs, no markers. Just two equally dark, equally uninviting paths disappearing into the forest. I slowed to a stop, the headlights illuminating nothing but more trees. Right or left? I closed my eyes for a moment, visualizing the hand-drawn map. There had been a fork in the road just before the X marking Dobbins Lodge. The right path had curved around what looked like a small lake or pond. I opened my eyes and turned right. The road immediately deteriorated, more dirt than asphalt now. The rental car bounced and shuddered over exposed roots and rocks. I slowed to a crawl, leaning forward as if those few extra inches would help me see better through the darkness, and then suddenly my headlights swept across something, a wooden sign half-rotted and leaning at a precarious angle. I braked hard, the car sliding slightly on the loose dirt. Throwing it into park, I grabbed my phone and used its flashlight to illuminate the sign. Dobbins Lodge, private property. My breath caught in my throat. This was it. This was the place. I killed the engine and sat in sudden, complete darkness. The silence was absolute. No distant traffic, no hum of civilization. Just the occasional creak of cooling metal from the car and the soft whisper of wind through the trees. I took stock of what I had. A phone with no service, a small flashlight, and the clothes on my back. No weapon, no backup. Just a father looking for his daughter in a place where people finished problems. It would have to be enough. I stepped out of the car, wincing at the sound of the door closing behind me. Even that small noise seemed deafening in the stillness of the forest. I clicked on my flashlight but kept it pointed at the ground, using just enough light to avoid tripping over roots and rocks. The path beyond the sign was barely visible, just a slightly less dense section of underbrush winding between the trees. I moved as quietly as I could, each step carefully placed to avoid snapping twigs or rustling leaves. After about 10 minutes of slow progress, I caught a glimpse of something through the trees ahead. A faint glow, steady and artificial. A light. My pulse quickened. I moved closer, staying low and using the trees for cover. The forest began to thin, and soon I could make out the dark silhouette of a building, a large cabin or small lodge, its weathered wooden walls barely visible in the darkness. The light I'd seen came from a single window on the ground floor, its glass cracked but intact. The rest of the building was dark and silent, looming against the night sky like a sleeping beast. I crept closer, moving from tree to tree, keeping my eyes fixed on that one illuminated window. Was Lila in there? Was she hurt? Was she scared? 20 yards from the building now, 15, 10. I could almost see inside the window, could almost make out shapes moving within. 5 yards away, I stepped out from behind the last tree, moving toward the cabin wall where I could peek through that cracked window. The crack of a gunshot split the night. Dirt exploded at my feet, spraying my legs with debris. I froze, heart hammering against my ribs, ears ringing from the sudden violent sound. "That's far enough," a voice called from the darkness. Next one goes in your chest." I dove behind the rusted hulk of an abandoned pickup truck, my shoulder slamming hard against the corroded metal as another shot cracked through the night air. The bullet pinged off the truck's frame, inches from my head. "I see him over by the truck!" a voice shouted from somewhere to my right. "Circle around back," another called. My heart hammered against my ribs as I pressed my back against the truck's wheel well, trying to make myself as small as possible. The cold, damp earth soaked through my pants, but I barely noticed. All I could think about was Lila, my daughter, somewhere in that lodge, needing me. I reached inside my jacket, fingers finding the small device Martha Jean had pressed into my hands during our last desperate meeting. "Take this," she'd whispered, her weathered hands trembling slightly. "It's a body cam, military grade, already linked to a secure server. Your people will see everything." At the time, I'd been skeptical. My people? What people? Martha Jean had given me a knowing look. "You're the Attorney General of the United States. Don't tell me you came here without backup waiting somewhere." She was right, of course. I had a team, federal agents stationed just outside county lines, waiting for my signal. I'd kept them at a distance, worried that their presence would only escalate the situation. Now I was grateful for that precaution. I tapped the small button on the side of the camera, confirming it was active. A tiny red light blinked once, then steady green. It was working. Streaming everything. "Come on out," the first voice called. "We just want to talk." Yeah, right. The way they talked with my daughter. Footsteps crunched through the underbrush, moving in my direction. I had maybe seconds before they flanked me. I took a deep breath, then Army crawled beneath the truck's rusted chassis, wincing as sharp edges of corroded metal scraped against my back. On the other side, I rolled into the shadows of a massive oak tree, just as a flashlight beam swept over the spot where I'd been hiding. "He's not here," the man with the flashlight called, confusion evident in his voice. "Well, he didn't just disappear," the other snapped back. "Find him." I used their momentary confusion to put distance between us, moving in a wide arc that would bring me around to the other side of the lodge. Every step was a calculated risk, moving fast enough to escape, but slow enough to avoid making noise. The lodge loomed ahead of me, its weathered walls silver gray in the moonlight. Most of the windows were dark, but I could see now that there were two sources of light, the one I'd spotted earlier at the front, and another fainter glow from the back of the building. I crept toward that second light, staying low, using every shadow and tree for cover. The voices of my pursuers grew more distant as they continued searching the area where they'd lost me. As I neared the back of the lodge, I could see that the window emitting the faint light was mostly boarded up, with just a narrow gap between two planks. I approached cautiously, my shoes silent on the damp earth, and pressed my eye to the gap. What I saw made my blood run cold. Lila sat in the center of what appeared to be a kitchen, tied to a wooden chair. Her head hung forward, dark curls obscuring her face, but I could see her shoulders moving with each breath. Alive. She was alive. Relief flooded through me, immediately followed by white-hot rage. Her wrists were bound to the chair arms with what looked like zip ties, cutting into her skin. She was struggling weakly, trying to free herself. A man in a sheriff's uniform paced back and forth in front of her, talking on a cell phone. I couldn't hear what he was saying, but his agitated gestures told me enough. This wasn't a simple kidnapping. This was a desperate situation spiraling out of control. I shifted slightly, trying to get a better angle to see if there were others in the room. The body cam pressed against my chest, capturing everything. Good. Let them all see what was happening here. Let them see what Judge Conrad and his cronies were capable of. My foot slipped on the wet ground, sending a small cascade of pebbles against the lodge's foundation. The noise was tiny, barely audible to me, but the sheriff inside immediately spun toward the window, his hand dropping to the gun at his hip. I froze, barely breathing, pressed flat against the wall beside the window. One wrong move now could get us both killed. If they spotted me, if they panicked. I closed my eyes briefly, forcing myself to think. The body cam was working. My team would be seeing this in real time. They would know exactly where we were, what was happening. Help would be coming. But would it arrive in time? The sheriff moved toward the window and I held my breath, willing him to turn away, to dismiss the sound as nothing more than the wind or a forest animal. Through the gap in the boards, I could see Lila again. She had raised her head, and even in the dim light, I could see the bruise darkening her cheek where Conrad had struck her. Her eyes were red-rimmed but alert, scanning the room as if searching for an opportunity. "That's my girl," I thought fiercely. "Don't give up." The sheriff moved away from the window, back to where Lila sat bound and helpless. I exhaled slowly, my heartbeat thundering in my ears. I needed to get closer, to hear what was happening inside. With extreme caution, I crept along the wall until I found a partially open window near the back door, its frame warped with age. "Getting complicated," the sheriff was saying as I positioned myself beneath the window. "Conrad wants this wrapped up tonight." Another voice responded, deeper, rougher. "We should have just grabbed her and done it right away. All this waiting around is stupid." "Orders are orders," the sheriff replied. "Besides, we need to make sure her daddy gets the message. Can't have him digging into the judge's business anymore." I adjusted my position, the body cam capturing every word. There were at least 3 of them inside. The sheriff, the rough-voiced man, and a third who laughed suddenly, the sound making my skin crawl. "You know what's funny?" the third man said. "How easy it is to make a suicide look real. Troubled teen, new town, bullied at school, daddy too busy with his fancy job to notice." My vision went red around the edges. I dug my fingernails into my palms until the pain brought me back. "Stay focused. For Lila." "We'll leave the note in her handwriting," the sheriff continued. "Plant some evidence of depression on her phone. By the time they find her body in the ravine, it'll be too late for anyone to question it. And her daddy will be too broken to keep digging," the rough voice added. "2 birds, 1 stone." They laughed together, the sound casual, as if they were discussing a football game rather than murdering my daughter. I wanted to burst through the door right then, to tear them apart with my bare hands. But I forced myself to breathe, to think. The body cam was recording everything. This was evidence. Irrefutable proof of conspiracy to commit murder. I needed to make sure it was transmitted, secured. "What if he calls in federal help?" one of them asked, suddenly serious. "He won't have time," the sheriff replied confidently. "Besides, Conrad's got friends in high places. By the time anyone important starts asking questions, we'll have cleaned up and moved on." I heard Lila make a small, frightened sound. One of the men laughed again. "Looks like Sleeping Beauty's waking up again. Want me to give her another dose?" "Nah," the sheriff said. "We need her coherent enough to write that note. Just keep her quiet." I'd heard enough. My team was standing by, waiting for my signal. I pulled out my phone, keeping it shielded against my body to hide the glow of the screen. With trembling fingers, I typed the single word we'd agreed upon. G.O. I pressed send and braced myself. For 3 heartbeats, nothing happened. Then the world exploded into light and sound. Powerful floodlights snapped on from all directions, bathing the clearing in harsh white light. The darkness that had hidden me vanished in an instant. Through the window, I heard shouts of confusion, chairs scraping against the floor. "Federal agents, drop your weapons!" The command boomed through megaphones echoing through the trees. Black-clad figures emerged from the forest, moving with practiced precision, weapons raised. My team had arrived, and they'd brought serious backup. Inside the lodge, chaos erupted. I heard the sheriff cursing, the crash of furniture being overturned. "It's a setup," someone shouted. "Get out the back." I moved away from the window, positioning myself beside the back door. If they tried to flee this way, they'd have to come through me. The door burst open and the sheriff emerged, gun drawn. He spotted me immediately, his eyes widening in shock. "You," he began, raising his weapon. Before he could finish, 2 agents tackled him from behind. His gun skittered across the ground as they forced him face down, securing his wrists with zip ties. I pushed past them into the lodge, my only thought now on Lila. The main room was in chaos, agents pouring in through doors and windows, shouting commands. One of the kidnappers had surrendered, kneeling with his hands behind his head. The third, the one with the rough voice, was backing toward Lila, his face contorted with rage. "Stay back," he shouted, pulling a hunting knife from his belt. "Stay back or she dies." He lunged toward Lila, the knife glinting in the harsh light. I didn't think. I moved. All the rage, all the fear that I'd been holding back exploded into action. I crossed the room in 3 strides and threw myself between the knife and my daughter. The man's eyes widened in surprise as I blocked his path. He slashed wildly with the knife, but his movements were clumsy, panicked. I caught his wrist mid-swing, twisting until I heard something snap. The knife clattered to the floor as he howled in pain. Federal agents swarmed him, pulling him away, securing him. I barely noticed. I turned to Lila, my hands already working to free her from the zip ties. "Dad?" she whispered, her voice cracked and dry. "You came." The knife clattered to the floor, but the attacker wasn't done. He lunged at me with a primal roar, his broken wrist forgotten in his rage. We collided hard, my shoulder taking the brunt as we crashed to the floor. The impact knocked the wind from my lungs, but adrenaline kept me moving. We rolled across the rough wooden planks, a tangle of limbs and fury. His elbow caught my jaw, sending stars exploding across my vision. I tasted copper as blood filled my mouth. This wasn't a fight with rules or restraint. This was raw survival. "You're dead," he snarled, spittle flying from his lips as he tried to wrap his hands around my throat. "Conrad's gonna make sure you never—" I slammed my forehead into his nose. The crunch was sickening but satisfying. He howled, momentarily stunned. I used the opening to flip him, driving my knee into his sternum. Sweat stung my eyes, and my knuckles were slick with blood. His or mine, I couldn't tell. From the corner of my eye, I saw Lila struggling. While the agents focused on the firefight erupting from another room, she'd managed to kick her chair sideways. The wooden legs splintered as it hit the floor. The impact loosened the ropes enough for her to start working her hands free. "Dad!" she cried out, her voice raw with fear. The sound of her voice gave me renewed strength. I drove my elbow into my attacker's solar plexus, making him gasp. But he was strong, country strong, the kind that comes from years of hard labor. He bucked beneath me, nearly throwing me off. "Federal agent, freeze!" Someone shouted nearby, but the man beneath me wasn't listening. He rolled us again, this time getting the upper hand. His weight crushed down on me as he grabbed a shard of broken glass from the floor. His eyes were wild, unfocused with pain and desperation as he raised it over my face. I grabbed his wrist with both hands, straining to keep the jagged edge from my throat. My arms trembled with the effort. He was going to win this. I could feel my strength failing. A sudden crack echoed through the room. The man's eyes widened in shock. Then he slumped forward, suddenly heavy and limp. Behind him stood an agent with her weapon raised, wisps of smoke still curling from the barrel. "You good, sir?" she asked, already moving to secure the unconscious man. I pushed him off me, gasping for breath. "Lila," was all I could manage to say. My daughter had worked herself free of the ropes, her wrists raw and bleeding. She scrambled toward me across the floor as agents swarmed the room, securing the remaining kidnappers. "We need to move now," an agent shouted as gunfire erupted from somewhere deeper in the lodge. "The place isn't secure." I didn't need to be told twice. I staggered to my feet, ignoring the screaming pain in my ribs, and pulled Lila up. Together we half ran, half stumbled toward the door, following the agent who had saved my life. Outside was chaos, flashing lights, shouting voices, the thump-thump of a helicopter somewhere overhead. The night air hit my sweat-soaked skin like ice water, making me shiver violently. We made it about 20 yards from the building before my legs gave out. I collapsed onto the damp earth, pulling Lila down with me. She fell against my chest, her entire body shaking with sobs. "I've got you," I whispered into her hair, holding her so tight it probably hurt. "I've got you now." Her fingers clutched at my shirt. I thought they were going to—" "Shh," I said, rocking her gently. "It's over. You're safe." But even as I said the words, movement near one of the federal SUVs caught my eye. 2 agents were escorting a handcuffed man toward the vehicle. Even in the harsh, uneven light of the emergency vehicles, I recognized that arrogant posture immediately. Judge Conrad. He wasn't dressed for the woods. His expensive suit looked bizarrely out of place among the tactical gear and camo. Blood trickled from a cut above his eye, but otherwise he looked unharmed. Unlike the other captives who hung their heads or struggled, Conrad walked with his chin high, his back straight. As they guided him toward the waiting vehicle, he turned his head. Our eyes met across the clearing. I expected rage. I expected hatred. What I saw was worse, a smirk of absolute confidence. Even in handcuffs, being led away by federal agents with mountains of evidence against him, the man believed he was untouchable. He held my gaze for a long moment, that smirk never wavering. Then he mouthed something I couldn't quite make out before the agents pushed his head down and guided him into the back of the SUV. "Dad?" Lila's voice pulled me back. She'd followed my gaze, seen Conrad too. "Is it really over?" I tightened my arms around her, watching as the SUV's doors slammed shut. Conrad might be in custody, but that look told me everything I needed to know. He had connections. He had power. He believed this was merely a temporary inconvenience. "The worst part is over," I told her, choosing my words carefully. "You're safe now, but we still have work to do." The lights from the emergency vehicles painted the forest in surreal flashes of red and blue. Agents moved with purpose all around us, securing the scene, gathering evidence. I knew what would come next: statements, depositions, hearings. The battle was shifting from physical to legal, from the darkness of these woods to the fluorescent lights of courtrooms. But looking at Conrad's confident smirk, I knew one thing for certain: this wasn't over yet. I watched Lila's chest rise and fall in the dim light of the safe house bedroom. The doctor had given her something to help her sleep, but even drugged, her face twitched with nightmares. Dark bruises bloomed across her cheekbone where one of Conrad's men had struck her. Her wrists were bandaged where the ropes had cut into her skin. I pulled the blanket higher over her shoulders and quietly closed the door, leaving it open just a crack so I could hear if she called out. "How is she?" Agent Ramirez asked as I entered the main room of the safe house, a converted farmhouse about 2 hours outside county lines. "Sleeping," I said, rubbing my eyes. "Finally." The room had transformed into a makeshift command center. Laptops covered the dining table, screens glowing in the pre-dawn darkness. 3 federal agents hunched over documents, sorting evidence into neat piles. The coffee pot in the kitchen had been running non-stop for hours. "We've got a lot to go through," Ramirez said, gesturing to the chair beside her. "Your body cam footage alone is gold. We've got them on kidnapping, assault, conspiracy." "And Conrad?" I asked, lowering myself into the chair. Every muscle in my body screamed in protest. I couldn't remember the last time I'd slept. "That's where it gets interesting." She slid a folder toward me. "The evidence from your daughter's initial courtroom incident, combined with Martha Jean's documentation, gives us a pattern of judicial misconduct going back decades." I flipped through the pages, scanning quickly. Falsified court records, missing evidence, suspicious deaths of witnesses. The corruption was breathtaking in its scope and audacity. "He's operated like this for years," I said, my voice hollow with disbelief. "How did nobody stop him?" "Small town. Big influence." Ramirez shrugged. "Plus he's got connections all the way up to the governor's office." A knock at the door made us all tense. 2 agents immediately reached for their weapons. "It's Martha Jean," called a voice from outside. "I've got more." Ramirez nodded to an agent who checked through the peephole before opening the door. Martha Jean stepped inside, clutching a battered cardboard box to her chest. Rain dripped from her silver hair, plastering it to her scalp. "I had to wait until they were distracted with the raid," she explained, setting the box on the table. "These were hidden in the courthouse basement. Records Conrad thought he'd destroyed years ago." I helped her unpack the contents: yellowed folders, old ledgers, even a few microfiche reels. "This goes back to when Conrad first became judge," Martha Jean said, her voice shaking slightly. "Proof of bribes, evidence tampering, witness intimidation. I kept copies of everything I could." "Why didn't you come forward before?" I couldn't keep the edge from my voice. Martha Jean's weathered face crumpled. "I was scared, we all were. You don't know what it's like, living under his thumb all these years. When people crossed him, they disappeared. Or worse." She looked directly at me, her eyes wet. "But when I saw what he did to your little girl in that courtroom, I couldn't stay silent anymore." I reached across the table and squeezed her hand. "Thank you." For the next few hours, we methodically built our case. The agents organized evidence chronologically, creating a timeline of Conrad's corruption. I provided context and legal analysis, identifying the most serious charges. Racketeering under RICO, I said, tapping a particularly damning document. That alone could put him away for 20 years. Add kidnapping and conspiracy to commit murder, Ramirez said, and he'll never see daylight again. The sun was just beginning to lighten the sky outside when Agent Dawson entered from the communications room, his face grim. Conrad's legal team is already moving, he said. They're preparing to argue that the courtroom incident was justified as parental discipline. They're claiming Conrad was acting in loco parentis, and that Lila was disruptive and threatening. My stomach turned. He slapped a 15-year-old girl across the face for politely speaking up. They're spinning it, Dawson continued. And for the kidnapping, they're claiming self-defense, that Conrad was protecting the community from dangerous outsiders threatening the judicial system. That's absurd, I spat. It's desperate, Ramirez corrected. But desperate people with powerful connections can be dangerous. They'll try to paint this as a federal overreach, an attack on local authority. I stood up, pacing the small room. They're going to smear my daughter, make her out to be some kind of delinquent who deserved what she got. Which is why we need your testimony, said a new voice. I turned to see a woman standing in the doorway. She wore a crisp suit despite the early hour, her badge identifying her as Federal Prosecutor Elaine Chen. Your perspective as both a parent and the Attorney General gives this case the weight it needs, she continued, setting her briefcase on the table. We need to hear, in your own words, exactly what happened in that courtroom, what you saw at the lodge, how they targeted your child. I glanced toward the bedroom where Lila slept. The thought of her having to relive this trauma on the witness stand made my blood boil. If I testify, I said slowly, can we keep Lila out of it? Chen hesitated. We'll try. The body cam footage might be enough, but Conrad's team will fight to discredit everything they can. I nodded, resolve hardening in my chest. Then I'll give them nothing to discredit. I'll lay out every detail, every moment, exactly as it happened. The room had grown lighter now, morning sunlight streaming through the windows. Chen looked at me, her expression both tired and determined. You ready to bury him? She asked simply. I thought of Conrad's smirk as they led him away in handcuffs. I thought of Lila tied to that chair, terrified and alone. I thought of Martha Jean, living in fear for decades. Not just bury him, I said. I want to make sure he never hurts anyone again. I walked into the federal courthouse with my shoulders back and head high. This wasn't my first time in a courtroom, but it was certainly the most personal. The marble halls echoed with whispers and the click of cameras as I passed. Security was tight. Federal marshals at every entrance, metal detectors humming, bomb-sniffing dogs patrolling the perimeter. They're calling it the trial of the decade, Agent Ramirez murmured beside me. Every major network is covering it. I nodded, not trusting myself to speak. Through the windows, I could see the media circus outside. Satellite trucks, reporters with microphones, protesters with signs both supporting and condemning Judge Conrad. This small-town corruption case had exploded into a national referendum on judicial abuse. The courtroom itself was imposing. High ceilings, polished wood, the American flag standing tall behind the judge's bench. I scanned the gallery, already packed with spectators. Martha Jean sat in the front row, hands clasped tightly in her lap. Several federal agents I recognized positioned themselves strategically around the room. And then I saw him. Conrad sat at the defense table, surrounded by expensive-looking attorneys in tailored suits. He wore a conservative blue tie and a practiced expression of wounded dignity. Our eyes met across the room, and the hatred in his gaze hit me like a physical force. I refused to look away. All rise. The bailiff's voice broke our staring contest as Judge Harriet Rosenthal entered, a federal judge brought in specifically to ensure impartiality. After the preliminaries, Prosecutor Chen approached the podium. The United States calls Attorney General Marcus Williams to the stand. My footsteps seemed unnaturally loud as I crossed to the witness box. After being sworn in, I settled into the hard wooden chair and faced the courtroom. Mr. Williams, Chen began, Please tell the court in your own words what happened when you and your daughter Lila attended a disciplinary hearing in Judge Conrad's courtroom 3 weeks ago. I took a deep breath and began. My voice stayed steady as I recounted that horrible day, the cold stares, the tension in the air, the moment Lila had politely spoken up, and Conrad's explosive reaction. He leaned over the bench, I said, and slapped my 15-year-old daughter across the face with enough force to knock her head to the side. Murmurs rippled through the courtroom. Conrad's lead attorney scribbled furiously on his legal pad. "And what was your reaction?" Chen asked. "I wanted to protect my daughter," I admitted. But I knew that reacting violently would only make things worse, so I restrained myself, even as I watched the bailiff smirk at what had happened. I continued through the entire ordeal, the trumped-up charges, the surveillance, the ransacked hotel room, and finally, Lila's abduction. When I found the map to Dobbins Lodge, I knew I had to go after her myself, I explained. I contacted federal agents who were positioned outside county lines, and they prepared to move in once I confirmed her location. "And what did you find at the lodge?" Chen asked. My hands tightened on the armrests. "I found my daughter tied to a chair. I heard Conrad's men discussing how they planned to kill her and make it look like suicide." Conrad's attorney shot to his feet. "Objection, speculation about my client's involvement." "Your Honor," Chen countered, "we have video evidence." Judge Rosenthal nodded. "Overruled. Continue, Mr. Williams." When my testimony concluded, Conrad's lead attorney approached for cross-examination. He was a slick operator named Harrington with a reputation for aggressive defense tactics. "Mr. Williams," he began, smiling thinly, "isn't it true that your daughter was being disruptive in Judge Conrad's courtroom?" She spoke politely when addressed. "Come now," Harrington pressed. "Wasn't she in fact rather mouthy toward a respected judge?" "Objection," Chen called. "Characterization." "Sustained," Judge Rosenthal said sharply. Harrington pivoted. "And isn't it true that you entered that courtroom with a hostile attitude toward Judge Conrad?" "I entered that courtroom expecting fair treatment under the law," I replied evenly. For nearly an hour, Harrington tried to twist my words, paint Lila as disrespectful, and portray me as an outsider with a vendetta. I remained calm, answering truthfully and directly. Finally, Chen stood. "Your Honor, the prosecution would like to enter into Evidence Exhibit 42, video footage from the body camera worn by Attorney General Williams during the rescue operation." The courtroom lights dimmed and a large screen descended. The footage was grainy but clear enough, showing my approach to the lodge, the gunshots fired at me, and finally, the interior where Lila sat bound to a chair. The audio captured every word of the kidnappers. "Once we're done with her, it'll look like she ran away and killed herself. Conrad says, make it convincing." Another voice. "Shame to waste such a pretty thing." Laughter. "Maybe we don't have to waste her completely." Gasps echoed through the courtroom. Someone in the gallery sobbed. I couldn't look at the screen, remembering all too vividly the rage and terror I'd felt in that moment. When the lights came back up, I glanced at Conrad. His face had drained of color. The smug confidence was gone, replaced by something I hadn't seen before. Fear. Real fear. His attorneys huddled around him, whispering urgently. Judge Rosenthal called for a 15-minute recess. As I stepped down from the witness stand, I caught Martha Jean's eye. She gave me a small, fierce nod. I walked past Conrad's table on my way out. He wouldn't look at me now, staring instead at his trembling hands. The man who had terrorized an entire community for decades suddenly seemed small, diminished. Justice was coming and he knew it. I returned to my seat beside Lila as the prosecution called their next witness. Martha Jean walked to the stand, her spine straight despite her years. She'd worked as Conrad's court clerk for over 2 decades before being forced into early retirement. As she raised her right hand to swear in, I noticed how badly her fingers trembled. "Ms. Calloway," Chen began, "how long did you work in Judge Conrad's courtroom?" 23 years, 4 months, and 16 days, she replied, and I counted every one of them toward the end. What followed was testimony so damning it seemed to physically press Conrad deeper into his chair. Martha Jean described systematic evidence tampering, witnesses threatened, and court fees that mysteriously disappeared. She'd kept meticulous records, hiding copies in her home even after being pushed out. "I knew someday someone would need to know the truth," she explained, her voice growing stronger. "I just prayed I'd live long enough to see it." During cross-examination, Conrad's attorney tried to paint her as a disgruntled ex-employee with a vendetta. Martha Jean fixed him with a stare that could have frozen fire. "Young man," she said, "I watched that man destroy lives for over 2 decades. My grudge isn't personal, it's moral." The courtroom fell silent. Even the judge seemed moved. Day 3 brought Timothy Gaines, a former defendant who'd spent 8 years in prison after Conrad railroaded him on fabricated drug charges. His real crime? Dating Conrad's niece against the judge's wishes. "He told me right before sentencing," Timothy testified, voice cracking, "that I should have known my place." By day 4, the dam broke completely. People lined up outside the courthouse to testify. Families who'd lost homes in suspicious foreclosures that benefited Conrad's real estate partners. A former bailiff who admitted to planting evidence. 3 women who'd been coerced into sexual favors to get charges against family members dropped. Each testimony built upon the last, creating a devastating portrait of corruption that had infected every corner of the county. The sheriff, now himself in custody, had been Conrad's enforcer, making problems disappear for a cut of the profits. The district attorney had buried complaints. Even certain state officials had looked the other way in exchange for political support. I watched Conrad throughout it all. His initial swagger had vanished completely. Now he hunched forward, eyes darting between witnesses and the jury. Several times, he tried to pass notes to his attorneys, who increasingly ignored him. On day 6, the prosecution called their final witness, Lila. I squeezed her hand before she stood. "You can do this," I whispered. She nodded once, her face set with determination that made my heart swell with pride. On the stand, Lila recounted the original hearing, her voice steady despite the subject matter. "I only said, 'Your Honor, may I explain what happened?' That's when he hit me." Chen guided her gently through the subsequent events, the false charges, the surveillance, the kidnapping. When asked about her time at the lodge, Lila's composure wavered only once. "They talked about me like I wasn't even human," she said quietly. "Like hurting me was just a job." Conrad couldn't look at her. For the first time, I wondered if some small part of him felt shame. The defense's closing arguments were desperate, grasping at procedural technicalities and attempting to shift blame to rogue elements, acting without Conrad's knowledge. Nobody was buying it. Chen's closing was masterful in its simplicity. "This case isn't about one slap in a courtroom," she told the jury. "It's about decades of tyranny disguised as justice, a system corrupted to serve one man's greed and ego. You have the power today to end that reign of terror." The jury deliberated for just 4 hours. When we returned to the courtroom for the verdict, the tension was unbearable. Lila's hand found mine, squeezing so tightly it hurt. I welcomed the pain. It meant we were here, together, alive. The jury foreman stood, paper trembling slightly in his hands. "On the count of assault against a minor, we find the defendant guilty." My breath caught. "On the count of kidnapping, guilty." Lila's grip tightened. "On the counts of racketeering, obstruction of justice, witness tampering, extortion." One by one, the guilty verdicts fell like hammer blows. Conrad guilty, the sheriff guilty, the bailiffs guilty. All of them, on all counts. The courtroom erupted. People embraced, some weeping openly. Martha Jean covered her face with her hands, shoulders shaking. 23 years of waiting for this moment. Judge Rosenthal called for order, then addressed Conrad directly. "Bail is denied for all defendants pending sentencing. You will be remanded to federal custody immediately." As federal marshals approached to take Conrad away, he finally looked at me, a hateful, defeated glare. I met his gaze steadily until he looked away first. Lila was still clutching my hand, tears streaming down her face. "It's over," she whispered. "It's really over." I pulled her into a hug, feeling her shoulders shake against me. Around us, the courtroom continued to buzz with emotion, relief, vindication, the collective exhale of a community finally freed from decades of fear. "Yes," I said, holding my daughter close. "It's over." Sentencing day arrived 3 weeks later with a bitter cold that seemed fitting for the occasion. The wind sliced across the courthouse steps like a razor, making the flags snap violently overhead. I pulled my coat tighter around me as Lila and I made our way up those grand marble steps one final time. "You okay?" I asked her, watching her breath cloud in the frigid air. She nodded, eyes fixed on the courthouse doors. "I want to see his face when they tell him." Reporters jostled for position on either side of the security barrier, shouting questions as we passed. The case had become national news, the corrupt judge who terrorized a town for decades finally facing justice. Camera flashes popped like lightning around us. "Attorney General, how does it feel to be back in your home state under these circumstances?" "Lila, do you have anything to say to Judge Conrad today?" I kept my arm around Lila's shoulders, guiding her through the chaos. We'd agreed to save our statements for her after the sentencing. This moment wasn't about sound bites for the evening news. Inside, the courtroom was already packed to capacity. Martha Jean had saved us seats in the front row. Her eyes were bright with anticipation as she squeezed my hand. "Never thought I'd live to see this day," she whispered. I nodded, scanning the room. Many of the faces had become familiar over the past weeks. Victims who'd testified, families seeking closure, reporters who'd followed the case from the beginning. The atmosphere crackled with tension and expectation. When they brought Conrad in, I barely recognized him. Gone was the arrogant tyrant who'd strutted through this courtroom for decades. The man shuffling in handcuffs between two marshals looked shrunken, his skin ashen, his shoulders hunched in the orange jumpsuit that hung loose on his frame. Prison hadn't been kind to him, even in these few short weeks. His eyes darted around the courtroom, perhaps searching for a friendly face, but finding none. When his gaze briefly met mine, I saw nothing of the venom that had been there during the trial, only a hollow emptiness that almost resembled fear. Judge Rosenthal entered, and we all rose. Unlike Conrad, she carried her authority with quiet dignity. I'd researched her extensively, a former civil rights attorney with 20 years on the federal bench and a reputation for fairness tempered with appropriate severity. "Be seated," she said, adjusting her glasses as she reviewed the papers before her. Conrad's attorney rose first, a young public defender who'd taken over after his expensive legal team abandoned him when his assets were frozen. "Your Honor, before sentencing, my client wishes to address the court." Judge Rosenthal nodded. "Mr. Conrad, you may speak." Conrad shuffled to the podium, chains clinking with each step. When he spoke, his voice wavered, nothing like the booming commands he'd once issued from his own bench. "Your Honor, I stand before you today as a man who has given 43 years of service to the judicial system," he began. I felt Lila stiffen beside me at his audacity. "I recognize that mistakes were made." "Mistakes?" Martha Jean muttered under her breath. "But I ask the court to consider my age and failing health," Conrad continued. "At 69, with hypertension and early signs of heart disease, a lengthy sentence would effectively be a death sentence." He paused, perhaps expecting some flicker of sympathy from the packed courtroom. He received none. "I've served this community my entire career. Surely that counts for something in the eyes of justice." Judge Rosenthal's expression remained impassive as Conrad returned to his seat. The prosecutor didn't even bother to rebut his statement. The evidence had spoken volumes already. After a brief pause, Judge Rosenthal removed her glasses and looked directly at Conrad. "Mr. Conrad, I have been on this bench for 20 years, and in that time I have sentenced murderers, terrorists, and hardened criminals of every stripe. But rarely have I encountered corruption as profound and damaging as yours." Her voice carried clearly through the silent courtroom. "You were entrusted with the most sacred duty our democracy offers, the fair and impartial administration of justice. Instead, you twisted that trust into a weapon to terrorize an entire community. You used your position to enrich yourself, punish your enemies, and protect your friends. You perverted the very concept of justice itself." Conrad stared at the table in front of him, unable to meet her gaze. "Your actions have destroyed lives, Mr. Conrad. Families lost homes. Innocent people went to jail. Children grew up without parents because of your corrupt rulings. And when finally confronted with your crimes, you attempted to kidnap and potentially murder a 15-year-old girl, rather than face the consequences of your actions. Judge Rosenthal paused, allowing her words to hang in the air. You speak of your service. What service? Your career was not service, it was a reign of terror. She picked up her gavel. It is the sentence of this court that you, Harrison James Conrad, be remanded to the custody of the Federal Bureau of Prisons for a term of life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. Additionally, all assets determined to be proceeds of your criminal enterprise are hereby forfeited to the federal government, to be distributed as restitution to your victims. The gavel came down with a crack that echoed through the courtroom. For a moment there was stunned silence, then the room erupted in cheers and applause. People embraced, some weeping openly. Martha Jean gripped my arm, tears streaming down her weathered face. I watched as the marshals approached Conrad. His shoulders slumped completely as the reality of his sentence sank in. Life. No parole, no comfortable retirement, just concrete walls and steel bars until death finally claimed him. As they led him away in chains, Conrad's eyes swept the courtroom one last time. The once untouchable tyrant shuffled toward the door, each step taking him further from power and closer to obscurity. His legacy was shattered forever, his name now synonymous with corruption rather than authority. Lila leaned against me, her body finally relaxing. It's really over, she whispered. I nodded, watching Conrad disappear through the door. Justice served. The aftermath of Conrad's sentencing wasn't the clean break I'd hoped for. The media circus intensified, with reporters camping outside our safe house, shouting questions whenever we emerged. Federal agents remained with us around the clock, a constant reminder that Conrad's network might have extended further than we knew. How much longer do we need to stay here? Lila asked one evening, her voice small as she pushed pasta around her plate. I wished I had a better answer. Just until they're certain all the loose ends are tied up, sweetheart. The truth was, I didn't fully trust that every corrupt official had been caught. Conrad's tentacles had reached into every corner of that county, the sheriff's department, the prosecutor's office, even state-level connections. The feds were still unraveling it all. My phone buzzed constantly. Publishers offering six-figure book deals, TV producers wanting exclusive interviews, talk shows, podcasts, documentary filmmakers, all clamoring for the inside story of how I took down a corrupt judge. The offers were tempting, especially financially. The legal battle had drained our savings, and rebuilding would take resources. One morning, a particularly persistent producer from a major network cornered me outside the safe house. Mr. Attorney General, the public deserves to hear your story, she insisted, thrusting her business card into my hand. We're talking primetime special, full hour, 7 figures easily. I looked at the card, then back at her eager face. And my daughter? What about her privacy? We could work around that, she said quickly. Or include her if she's comfortable. Teenage girls love being on TV, right? This could make her famous. I thought about Lila's nightmares, how she still flinched at sudden movements, how therapy was teaching her to breathe through panic attacks. No, I said firmly, handing back the card. Not interested. The producer's smile faltered. You're making a mistake. This story has everything. Corruption, danger, a father's love. People need to hear it. I stepped closer, lowering my voice. What my daughter needs is to heal, in private. That matters more than what people need to hear. I walked away as she called after me. At least think about it. This opportunity won't last forever. But I already knew what mattered. I'd seen Lila's face light up when her therapist suggested we consider relocating somewhere new, somewhere without memories or recognition. We could start fresh, she'd said, a spark of hope in her eyes for the first time in weeks. That evening, I declined every pending offer and started researching quiet suburbs across the country. Places with good schools, low crime rates, and most importantly, no connection to our past. I found a peaceful neighborhood in a mid-sized town 3 states away, close enough to visit Martha Jean occasionally, but far enough that no one would recognize us. The house we chose was modest but warm, a two-story colonial with a fenced backyard and mature trees providing privacy from neighbors. We moved in on a rainy Tuesday, the kind of unremarkable day that promised the ordinary life we craved. Lila's new school welcomed her without fanfare. I took a teaching position at a local university's law department, a significant step down from my previous career, but the hours were regular and the work meaningful. Slowly, we established routines. Breakfast together every morning, therapy appointments twice weekly for Lila, once for me, movie nights on Fridays. The nightmares didn't stop immediately. I'd still wake to Lila's muffled cries some nights, rushing to her room to assure her that she was safe, that Conrad was locked away forever. But gradually, the good days began to outnumber the bad. 3 months after our move, we were unpacking the last of our boxes, things that hadn't seemed urgent when we first arrived. Lila was sorting through a box of her belongings when she suddenly went still. "Dad?" she called, her voice catching. I looked up from the bookshelf I was organizing to see her holding something small and broken. Her old cell phone, screen shattered beyond repair, case cracked where it had hit the ground when they took her. She walked over and silently placed it in my palm. The weight of it felt impossibly heavy, this small piece of technology that represented everything we'd survived. I remembered the heart-stopping moment I'd found it abandoned in the dirt, the terror that had consumed me. Lila's eyes met mine, and I saw understanding there beyond her 15 years. We didn't need words. Some wounds never fully fade, but they become part of who you are, not defining you but reminding you of your strength. I pulled her into a hug, the broken phone pressed between us. "What should we do with it?" she asked softly. I considered for a moment. "Whatever you want. We could throw it away or—" "Keep it," she finished. "Not somewhere I have to see it every day, but I don't want to pretend it never happened." I nodded, understanding completely. "How about the memory box your therapist suggested?" Later that evening, we placed the phone in a wooden box alongside other remnants of our ordeal. Newspaper clippings of Conrad's sentencing, Martha Jean's hand-drawn map, a thank you card from a family Conrad had wronged who'd testified at the trial, not to dwell on the past but to acknowledge it. As we closed the lid, Lila took a deep breath. "I think I'm going to be okay, Dad." I looked at my daughter, still healing, still occasionally haunted, but standing tall and facing forward. "I know you are," I said. "We both are." 6 months after the trial, I found myself leaning against the kitchen counter, watching steam rise from my coffee mug. Morning sunlight streamed through our kitchen windows, casting warm patterns across the hardwood floor of our new home. The quiet neighborhood around us was just waking up. Distant sounds of car doors closing, the occasional dog bark, a newspaper delivery van rumbling down the street. Our life had found its rhythm again, a gentle, steady beat that no longer carried the frantic energy of survival. I glanced at the clock, 7:45 a.m. Right on cue, Lila appeared in the doorway, her curly hair pulled back in a loose ponytail, backpack slung casually over one shoulder. She'd grown an inch since everything happened, her face losing some of its childhood softness. The changes weren't just physical. There was a quiet confidence in her eyes now, a hard-won resilience. "Morning, Dad," she said, grabbing an apple from the fruit bowl. "I'm meeting Jasmine early to finish our science project." I smiled, savoring the beautiful ordinariness of her words. "Need a ride?" "Nah," she replied, taking a bite of the apple. "It's nice out. I'll walk." I nodded, watching as she moved around the kitchen with easy familiarity. The nightmares had become less frequent for both of us. Her therapist said she was making remarkable progress, though we both understood that healing wasn't linear. Some days were harder than others, but the trajectory pointed upward. "Don't forget we're having dinner with Professor Ramsey and his wife tonight," I reminded her. "The one who keeps trying to get you to write that book?" Lila asked with a knowing smile. I chuckled. "That's the one." "You should consider it, you know," she said, leaning against the counter beside me. "Maybe someday. When it feels right." The suggestion surprised me. For months, I'd shut down every conversation about documenting our experience. But hearing Lila mention it so casually made me wonder if, perhaps someday, When enough time had passed, there might be value in sharing our story. Not for fame or vindication, but as a testament to justice and healing. Maybe someday, I echoed, ruffling her hair like I used to when she was small. She ducked away with a teenage eye roll that made my heart swell with gratitude for such normal adolescent behavior. Gotta go, she announced, adjusting her backpack. See you tonight. I followed her to the front door, watching as she paused to check her reflection in the hallway mirror. The faint scar near her temple, a reminder of that night at Dobbins Lodge, had faded to a thin silver line, barely visible unless you knew to look for it. My eyes drifted to the small table by the door where my leather U.S. Attorney General folder rested. I kept it there deliberately, not as a reminder of what we'd lost, but as a symbol of the justice we'd fought for and won. I hadn't returned to that position, choosing instead the quieter life of a law professor. The folder remained a silent guardian, a physical reminder that systems could be held accountable, that corruption could be defeated. Lila noticed me looking at it and touched it briefly with her fingertips. Our unspoken ritual. Then she opened the door, letting in the fresh spring air. "Love you, Dad," she called over her shoulder. "Love you too," I replied, watching as she stepped outside, head held high. I stood in the doorway, tracking her progress down our tree-lined street until she turned the corner. Then I returned to the kitchen, refilled my coffee, and carried it to the back porch. The garden we'd planted together was beginning to bloom, daffodils pushing through the soil, promising color and renewal. My phone buzzed with a text from Martha Jean. "Thought you'd want to know. Conrad's appeal was denied." Again. I smiled, typing back a simple, "Thank you." We still kept in touch, though less frequently now. She'd become something of a local hero back in that town, helping to rebuild the justice system from the ground up. Setting down my phone, I leaned back in my chair and closed my eyes, letting the sun warm my face. The weight I'd carried for so long had gradually lightened, not disappeared. I don't think it ever would completely, but transformed into something manageable, even purposeful. Later that afternoon, I'd lecture on ethics in the justice system to a classroom of eager law students. I'd grade papers at my desk while waiting for Lila to return from her after-school drama club. We'd prepare dinner together, laughing about her teacher's dramatic reading of Shakespeare. Normal moments, strung together like pearls. Justice had been served, and this time it stuck. Not just in courtrooms and prison sentences, but in the quiet victory of our everyday lives. In Lila walking to school with her head held high. In my ability to watch her go without panic clawing at my throat. I sipped my coffee, letting contentment settle around me like a comfortable blanket. Outside, birds sang in the maple tree, oblivious to how precious this ordinary morning truly was. We were safe, we were healing, we were home. If you enjoyed this story, I hand-picked this next story that you will enjoy. Please don't miss this one. Click here to watch it. If you enjoyed this story, I hand-picked this next story that you will enjoy. Please don't miss this one. Click here to watch it.